Okay, we're going to wrap up chapter 5. We spent the previous lecture talking about some characteristics of eukaryotic cells, the organelles and so forth, and also got into the first of the 4 major groups, which of course were the fungi. So we're done with fungi. We have left to talk about algae, protozoa, and some interesting worms, parasitic worms. So algae, well, when we think of algae, we should immediately think of their ability to undergo photosynthesis. Most of the time people think of green algae because it's probably the most common type, but there's other types, as we'll talk about in just a few minutes. There's red algae, there's brown algae, and green. Those are probably the 3 biggest types or colors, I guess. These, remember, are eukaryotic. They possess that membrane-bound nucleus and all of those organelles you learned about in earlier sections of chapter 5. And they range wildly in terms of their shape. Most are unicellular, meaning made of one cell. But as you remember from lab, we also could talk about filamentous and colonial types of algae. And we'll review a couple of those in just a few moments. But filamentous, just think of filaments, kind of green filaments, slimy, slippery green filaments. Those are typically green algae. Colonial, meaning that they're in a colony, and we'll talk about volvox and show you a picture of volvox in a few minutes. Probably the most classic type of colonial green alga there is. And most, again, are pretty small. You'd need a microscope to see a lot of these. However, some of the brown algae, like kelp, can be 100 meters or more in length. So they don't all have to be microscopic. The vast majority of algae are, but some are actually very, very big. Kelp is just a fascinating group of algae that I wish we had more time to talk about, but it doesn't really so much apply to microbiology. Remember, all of these types of algae, whether it's red or brown or green, are photosynthetic. Many of them take on their color based upon the types of pigments in their chloroplasts, the most abundant of which are the chlorophylls. Those are what typically give the green and blue-green colors that we associate with algae. They also have, in addition to a cell membrane, an outer cell wall. I remember us talking a little bit about that earlier. And that cell wall, remember, provides structure to the cell. Some of these are motile, as we see in the upper right-hand part of this slide. There's flagellated algae there. And in the lower right-hand corner is a group of algae called the diatoms. They are not motile. They do not have flagella, but they are nonetheless very fascinating organisms that we'll, again, get into really soon. What we're seeing there actually are the shells of these interesting diatoms. If you've had lab or you are in lab, you might remember us looking at diatom shells. Speaking of which, let's look at a couple interesting slides that have been made. These are actual individual diatom shells. Each one of these circular or slender elongated structures are individual shells of dead diatoms, a type of algae. And you can imagine the amount of work that went into putting together this very elaborate design. But somebody made this somehow with a very fine brush or some ability to move those diatoms in the proper orientation. Some of these, by the way, have been stained to bring on certain colors to the diagram like you see here. Actually, I will say that these orange and yellow structures, these are not diatoms. These are actually scales of a butterfly. You know, when you were a kid and you grabbed a butterfly by its wings, and when you let it go, you had the powder on your fingers. Well, if you were to look at that powder, if you will, under the microscope, what you'd really be seeing are the scales of the butterfly. Yeah. And so that's what this is. These are individual scales amid many, many, many diatom shells. Quite astounding, isn't it? In fact, back in the Victorian era in the 1800s, this was quite a popular hobby for the aristocrats of England, the rich folks, the royalty. They had nothing better to do than to sit down and move these diatoms in different positions to make these absolutely amazing designs on slides. So you had to look under a slide to see this. Hard to imagine. There's a link there. You can check it out. Okay, so as we've said, algae are photosynthetic. When we use the term plankton, which is a very kind of generic term, which applies both to saltwater, ocean, and freshwater aquatic environments, a lot of what we mean when we say plankton is green algae. And they provide such an important trophic level in that particular aquatic ecosystem. We talk about them being the primary producers. You might remember hearing about that when you took earth science in high school, perhaps. So these organisms provide the framework from which other trophic levels emerge. And they are extremely important as photosynthetic organisms in producing copious amounts of oxygen. Most of us think of plants when we think of photosynthesis and their role in charging the atmosphere with oxygen that we in turn, of course, inhale and utilize. And I'm not saying anything against plants. I love plants. They do a great job. But with the earth being covered, what, 70 or 80% of it by water, these guys, the microscopic algae, contribute more oxygen to the Earth's atmosphere than plants do, by orders of magnitude. One particular group of algae that are quite interesting are called the Dinoflagellates. And so in the lower middle part of this slide, you see an aerial photograph taken of a bloom of Dinoflagellates. These are microscopic algae. And when conditions are just right in the ocean, temperatures just perfect, and the nutrient supply is just perfect, these dinoflagellates will begin to divide exponentially to the point at which the water literally turns red from the pigments and also toxins that these microscopic algae give off. And what they can do is produce so much neurotoxin in these aquatic marine ecosystems that filter feeders like clams and oysters, they will bring that water in, because these organisms are called filter feeders. A clam or an oyster doesn't have a mouth like you do. It doesn't have teeth to grind up food. So it filters its nutrients from the water. And these particular marine mollusks are filtering the water for nutrients, but they're also filtering this water that's been contaminated with all of these neurotoxins. Now, it doesn't kill the shellfish, surprisingly, but these toxins can build up in the muscle of the mussel. And if you eat the mussel, if you eat the clam or the oyster or the mollusk that has filtered that food, or filtered that water rather, rich in the neurotoxins, you then ingest those toxins and you come down with something called paralytic shellfish poisoning. And you can check out this link that talks more about its impact on human health. But suffice to say, you can die from paralytic shellfish poisoning if you eat contaminated shellfish. And it's due again to blooms of dinoflagellates creating this red tide phenomenon. Now, your book has a table in it that begins to classify different types of algae. And I will simply say that I do not want you to get all caught up in the taxonomy here. We'll talk more about these different terms, the supergroups in a little bit later. But the common name is sort of what I would probably cue in on. We've talked a little bit about the Dinoflagellates with respect to red tide. We've talked about diatoms with regard to those beautiful shells that created those gorgeous slides. By the way, before I forget, diatoms are also important in the formation of what's called diatomaceous earth, which is something you can purchase in different types of silver polishes have diatomaceous earth. It acts as an abrasive. Toothpaste has diatomaceous earth in it. Pool filters have diatomaceous earth in it. So there's a lot of commercial use actually of these shells of dead diatoms. Here's our largest of the algae, the kelp that I talked about earlier, that could be 100 meters or 300 plus feet long. Fascinating organisms in and of themselves. Here's red algae. What do you remember about red algae? Well, from lab, I hope you remember that this is the source of agar that we use to grow bacteria on, right? And so you can come back to this table if you ever want to know, well, what makes diatoms different from green algae in terms of, characteristics and so forth. But you don't need to memorize the supergroup names. Just sort of be familiar with some of the common names. So we're going to now shift away from the algal protists to the protozoans, which are more like animal-like protists. When I say animal-like, I mean this in the sense that they're more motile, they're more heterotrophic. Okay, some are autotrophic. In other words, like algae can undergo photosynthesis and produce their own organic compounds. But heterotrophic, you might remember, means they have to take in food. So all protozoa are heterotrophic. Some are also autotrophic, but the vast majority hetero. Some of these have some very interesting roles to play as parasites that we'll be talking more about. And some hitch a ride on certain types of vectors, often insects, to be transmitted to a host that would get that particular disease. And we'll talk again more about that in just a second. But suffice to say, it is a huge, huge, huge diverse group. 65,000 species. It's probably at least 50% more than that by now. Very motile. Well, what characterizes protozoa, as I said a moment ago, is the fact that many of them are quite motile. And we see a couple photos here of a group of Euglena, which you can tell are green. So they, again, are autotrophic, but can also take in food, so are heterotrophic. Here's Paramecium, like Euglena or Euglenoids, a group. It's considered a group term. Euglena would be a genus. This is a genus because I have it italicized, or I could underline it, but the capital P is indicating genus. We saw this in lab, and you note again the presence of cilia in this very nice compound light microscope photo. Very motile, Paramecium is. It's a type of ciliate. There's tons of different kinds of ciliates, but they of course use their cilia to move through the water. And then there's others that are amoeba-like. And we'll talk more about amoebas, but this is a single cell. You can see the nice nucleus here in the center. And what it's doing is it's extending its cell membrane and forming what are called false feet or pseudopodia. So if it finds, say, some food here or maybe a bacterium, it can phagocytize, it can surround the food, if you will, or the bacterium with its pseudopodia, and then bring that food inside, and then using its lysosomes can break that recently phagocytized vesicle containing the food or the bacteria or whatever it might be, and basically use it in a heterotrophic way. Most protozoa exist in two forms. And here's one of those two forms. This is the form that we're probably most familiar with. This is the active feeding stage, referred to as the trophozoite form. And so when conditions are really good, plenty of food, good temperature in the water or wherever this protist lives, it's maintained in this very active feeding trophozoite stage. But when conditions turn harsh, things dry out, the amount of nutrients begins to decline, then this trophozoite is going to change into a cyst. And it's this cyst form that can stay in this dormant state for a long time until conditions improve, moisture levels increase, food becomes abundant, and then it will undergo a metamorphosis, so to speak, and form back into the active feeding trophozoite stage. It's somewhat reminiscent or similar in a kind of indirect way to how a vegetative cell of a bacterium, if it's an endospore former, right, can form into an endospore, ride out those dry times when there's not much nutrients around until things improve, and then the endospore germinates into a vegetative state. So it's kind of similar to that, although don't get them mixed up. This is a eukaryotic cell. This is a protozoan of some sort, not a bacterium. And I'll just let you read over that slide. Okay, so another table with some additional taxonomy here. Not to confuse you, do not freak out when you see this. I'm not going to be asking you to regurgitate this table. I simply want to have you be aware of the three major supergroups, they're called, within which some pathogenic protozoa would be classified. Okay, and the first one you see here is the supergroup SAR. Now, you might wonder, what does SAR stand for? If you Google SAR, what it will say is the S stands for stramenopiles, A stands for alveolates, and R stands for rhizaria. So these are additional taxonomic groups. They're called clades, C-L-A-D-E-S. And this is a fairly recent change to the textbook. If you happen to be using the 10th edition of Talaro's Foundations in Microbiology, they don't have these new supergroups in the chapter. So this is a new table. But what it does indicate here are some specific organisms, of which we'll talk about a few, what diseases they cause, and finally, where do they reside, either in the environment or how are they transmitted by a vector. So let's talk about some representative pathogenic protozoans, and we'll just maybe talk about two or three, or maybe just one in this last group. And we'll start off with the SAR supergroup. And within this group is a subset of what are called the epicomplexans. Epicomplexans. And what these epicomplexans all share is a unique structure called an apical complex, which is used to penetrate into the host cell. So Cryptosporidium is one of those that was listed in that preceding table. And this particular epicomplexan is a free-living organism that lives in water. And if you happen to ingest water that contains the protist Cryptosporidium, you can come down with some really, really bad diarrhea. And as it mentions here, the CDC is estimating that close to 750,000 cases of cryptosporidiosis, it's called, is the disease, via ingestion of contaminated water. Water can contain all sorts of interesting things, and this is one of them. Here's another interesting organism in this SAR supergroup. Its genus is Plasmodium, as evidenced again by the capital P and the fact this is italicized. I'd like you to all get into the habit when you write a genus and a species term or terms down on a test or quiz or in lab, that you, again, capitalize the first letter of the genus. All the rest of the letters are lowercase. And if you write out the species, all those letters are lowercase. Both terms either italicized or underlined so that we know this is a Latin term, set of terms. Okay, malaria, you've all heard of it. It's a tropical disease. It has a complex life cycle. I am not going to spend a ton of time on this slide, but just kind of go over the basics of it. In essence, what carries this small single-celled parasitic protozoan is the vector called the Anopheles mosquito. Again, what is this term? It's a genus, right? So here's the Anopheles mosquito. You can tell it's sucked up some blood. Its abdomen is bright red, and it's always the female insect that's biting you to get your blood because it needs the protein for its eggs. Male mosquitoes and flies don't bite. It's the females that bite. So a female mosquito, let's say, is harboring the Plasmodium. It bites you, it sucks up your blood, and inadvertently introduces the parasite into your bloodstream. From there, the parasite, the Plasmodium, will travel to your liver, where it will undergo some developmental changes. I am, again, not going to go into this. You don't need to know all these different terms, but basically what happens is in the liver, it goes through, again, some changes that ultimately end up infecting red blood cells. And then there's some additional developmental changes that occur to the parasite in the RBC. Ultimately, the red blood cell will lyse, it'll pop, okay? And during the time at which the red blood cells all pop is when the individual typically has a severe fever. And depending upon the species of Plasmodium, some species will induce a 48-hour cyclical fever in the individual, and other species of Plasmodium will induce a 72-hour, approximately, fever cycle. So one way to diagnose what species of Plasmodium you've been infected with is to time the fevers. Kind of interesting. If another mosquito bites you to get your blood, it could suck up what are referred to as the gametocytes, which are also formed in the red blood cell. And then the gametocytes are brought into the mosquito's circulation, where they undergo some additional changes, morphologic changes in the gut of the mosquito, and we repeat the process. And so here in this box, it indicates some symptoms of malaria, including, organ failure, which could kill you and has killed millions of people over the last 100 years. There are drugs you can take, either prophylactically or, and that means, of course, before you, say, travel to the tropics. When we used to go to Costa Rica and Panama, the CDC suggested, because of the different provinces that we traveled to, that we take a prophylactic drug called chloroquine. It kind of depends on where you go. Sometimes doxycycline is more effective at treating a particular type of Plasmodium. So if you go to Brazil or the Amazon, you might be prescribed doxycycline. Or if you go to Panama or Colombia or somewhere like that, you might be prescribed a different drug. So anyway, you take the drug prophylactically, you take it a week before you go, take a pill, and then like every 3 days, you take one more pill. And then once you get back home, you take a pill, I think once every 3 or 4 days for like 2 weeks. So you have a constant level of this drug in your body so that if you were to get bitten by a mosquito and have that parasite injected into you, you'd have that high level of drug in your body that would prevent all of these different stages to take place in the liver and the red cells and all that stuff. You wouldn't get Plasmodium. But it's a nasty disease. And still today, lots of people die from malaria. In fact, just 5 years ago, the CDC and the World Health Organization estimated close to 200 million cases of malaria worldwide, with close to 500,000 people dying. So this remains a serious tropical disease. Again, you can see where it's most prevalent here in the red and in the yellow. And again, the equator runs right about here. So it is, again, thought of as a tropical disease. However, historically, you probably didn't know this, but when Washington, D.C. was first built in the 16 and 1700s, it was built on a wetland, a swamp. So drain the swamp. You've heard that phrase that the Trump kind of popularized 4 years ago. Well, there actually was a swamp. Washington, D.C. was built on a huge swamp. It's right near the Chesapeake Bay. And there are cases back in the time of George Washington, and even after that, where malaria crept as far north as D.C. Yeah, so it has been documented in the U.S. And even today, once in a while, you hear of malarial cases. They're not super common, but in the southern part of the U.S., it can happen. Much more common in the tropics, though. Okay, shifting now to another supergroup, Excavata, it's called. We're going to talk about a couple different examples of organisms in this group that can cause some interesting infections. And here's one of them called Giardia lamblia. Don't you just love that? Just kind of rolls off your tongue. Giardia lamblia. You can tell it is a single-celled protist, lives in fresh water. And this is an organism that you can get locally if you drink water coming off a hillside, let's say you're out hiking in the Allegheny National Forest, which is south of us in PA. Beautiful temperate forest, very clean, nobody lives within miles. And you have this nice freshwater stream, and you're out there hiking in July and August, and you're so hot, and you left your water back at the car, and you want to drink. And you have this babbling brook. It's a very thin little stream. It's got to be safe to drink. And you drink it. It's nice and cold. You enjoy a drink. And then a week later, you come down with the worst case of diarrhea you've ever had. Odds are you ingested this protozoan called Giardia. Anytime wild animals, which typically harbor this in their digestive system, when animals poop, this can get into the water. And if you drink the water, that's how you get the parasite. So it is a nasty, nasty little guy. And it's found actually all over the world. Here's another really interesting parasite in the supergroup Excavata called Tripanasoma. And this is specifically talking about the Brucei species. There are different kinds of trypanosomes. This is one. We'll show you another one in the next slide. This was what we discussed in lab, I think our second week, when you looked at different organisms under the microscope. As you can tell, this is causing a tropical disease, again, more common in Africa, called African sleeping sickness. Like malaria, trypanosomiasis is vectored by an arthropod. In this case, it's a tsetse fly. So here's the female tsetse fly, bites you, again, the female, to get your blood, so it has protein for its eggs. It injects you with Trypanosoma brucei. This can get into your bloodstream. It can get into your lymphatic system. It can even get into the spinal fluid surrounding your spinal cord and your brain. And here's what it looks like under the microscope. This is what we saw in lab. a month ago almost now. These are red blood cells, these circular pink structures should look familiar to you. And then these guys here with a little undulating membrane and the flagellum, these are the trypanosomes. And they can cause all sorts of symptoms in the individual: fever, lethargy, headaches, joint pains. And in very severe advanced cases of African sleeping sickness, the individual begins to get so lethargic that they sleep a lot more and they can fall into a very deep coma. And basically, the end is death. So it's a very nasty tropical disease. So always take some DEET with you when you go to the tropics. Keep those mosquitoes and those tsetse flies at bay. Like the Anopheles mosquito, this tsetse fly would harbor various morphologic stages of the trypanosome, which are shown over here on the left-hand side. Again, don't worry about where this occurs in the tsetse fly. Just realize that this particular protist, like the Plasmodium, requires a vector in its life cycle, but also to transfer it to you. So if we could control the vector, right, i.e. the mosquito or the fly, then we would be controlling the infection, wouldn't we? And that's one approach that the World Health Organization has tried to do over the last 100 years, is to try to do aerial spraying or reduce the likelihood of mosquitoes and other arthropods that can vector some of these tropical diseases. Here's another type of trypanosome called Trypanosoma cruzi. Now remember, the previous one was Trypanosoma brucei, so this is a different species. And what this particular trypanosome causes is a disease called Chagas disease, which is more common in Central America and South America. The vector for Chagas disease is not the tsetse fly. It's a little bug called the reduviate bug. Now here you see a picture of a reduviate bug. We actually have similar beetles, bugs here in the US, even in our area. This is not the same bug that causes Chagas disease. It's related to it, but you've maybe heard of stink bugs. They look real similar to this. Okay, so what ends up happening is the reduviate bug will harbor a stage of the trypanosome. Okay, so again, here's what it would look like inside the reduviate bug, just like it looks quite similar, doesn't it, as we saw in the previous slide of the sleeping sickness, has this undulating membrane and it's flagellated. And so what the reduviate bug does is when you're sleeping at night, it crawls up onto you and goes to the corner of your mouth and bites you while you're sleeping. Why does it bite you? Well, it's not really biting you, it's kissing you, which is why it's called the kissing bug. It's biting you there because that's where the skin is the thinnest. When the female reduviate bites you to get the blood for its eggs, it introduces the trypanosome into you. And I won't go over the symptoms. You can check out the CDC hyperlink that talks more about Chagas disease. I would encourage you to check it out. It is a problem in, again, Latin America more than any other area in the world. Mothers can pass on this to their fetus during pregnancy. Isn't that scary? Yeah. So 300,000 people, even in the US, get this. So it's not always necessarily in Latin America. This map doesn't include the US, but according to the CDC, there are some cases in the US. Mostly probably from people who have been here and then travel home, because the reduviate bug doesn't typically live in the US. So it's travelers that are bringing it back, and that's where it's being diagnosed once they get back to the US. notice 50,000 people die of it, so it's significant. Okay, the other major supergroup in that previous table was the supergroup Amoebazoa. We've actually already talked a little bit about amoeba, remember, with its pseudopodia. And so here's a photograph of a single-celled amoeba. And you can see these interesting pseudopodia. If you watch this under the microscope, you can actually see it slowly extending its cytoplasm through these pseudopodia as it slowly moves through its watery environment. So it's kind of interesting. Well, the amoeba that we want to talk briefly about is Entamoeba histolytica. And like the earlier example that we had of the Cryptosporidium, this also is found in water, oftentimes. Could be in food, contaminated food as well. But when you ingest water or food that contains the cyst, now remember we said this is the desiccated kind of resting form of the parasite that we described in the earlier slide. You ingest the cyst, it gets into your digestive system, and there it begins to feed and grow when it then shifts into the trophozoite stage. So it changes from cyst into trophozoite in your large intestine, typically. From there, the trophozoite can penetrate the lining of the intestine and invade the liver, lungs, and skin. Symptoms include, of course, nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, and so much diarrhea that there's weight loss problems and dehydration. Somebody can actually die as a result of the effects of this because they're losing so much water. Their electrolyte balance is thrown off. There's just a real significant alteration in the chemistry of the body fluids. And this is simply due to ingestion of the cyst form of the Entamoeba. So when you go to the tropics, or really almost anywhere, but especially to the tropics, or Africa or Asia, it's always a good idea as a tourist to use bottled water, not just to avoid Entamoeba histolytica, but to avoid all sorts of waterborne diseases, and there are lots of them. A lot of the locals can deal with it, although they can get sick too, but their digestive system has been inoculated with a lot of these things, and they're a little more used to it. But when we go over there, it can ravage our body so much easier, and it's not fun getting sick when you're traveling to the middle of the Amazon rainforest. And you're not close to a lot of health centers there, you know. So just, there are always these things we tell our students when we go to the tropics. You know, drink bottled water, or if you drink tap water, make sure you know it's from a reliable filtered source at the hotel or hostel or whatever you're staying at. Avoid ice. Avoid eating raw fruits or salads because they've been rinsed with water that could be contaminated with the amoeba cyst, for example, and you ingest that, you're on your way to some fun diarrhea. Okay, and finally, as we begin to get toward the end of the chapter, our fourth group here, the parasitic helminths. These are actually multicellular worms. Some of these, in fact, the majority of them are large enough that you can see them with the naked eye. So unlike, you know, the protists and some of the fungi and some of the algae that you need a microscope to see them, in the case of these things, most of the adult forms, if you will, of these are very easy to see. There are some microscopic life cycle forms, though, but most are big enough you can see them. What's kind of cool about these parasitic worms is that many of them don't have a digestive system, a well-developed digestive system, because they're relying on the host to provide the pre-digested organic material that they just then absorb. Okay. So we often associate these parasitic helminths, not all, but many, with our digestive tract. At least that's where you go to find a lot of these kinds of organisms. They're often just super well developed organisms that have lots of organs to produce eggs, and those eggs combine with sperm to form fertilized eggs, as you'll see, that can pass out in your feces and contaminate the environment. And then if you were to get some of the eggs back into you, or if you got it from some other source, so you never had any issues with tapeworms, but you ingest the eggs, then you could have tapeworm issues. So those fertilized eggs, again, have to somehow get out of the host body, get into the environment, and that's a reservoir for potential contamination or acquisition by another individual. So let's talk about these in more detail, realizing that there's about 50 or so species of parasitic helminth worms, that they're distributed all over the world. Higher incidence in the tropics than in temperate areas, but we have them here too, but more common in the tropics. And the vast majority are either ingested in the food or the water, or just, you know, your fingernails have some soil underneath, or they're not clean. You touch your mouth. These microscopic fertilized eggs can get in, and then the fun begins. Some of these are vectored by insects, just like we saw earlier with regard to mosquitoes and tsetse flies and reduviid bugs. There are other arthropods like those that can vector some of these microscopic forms of the worm. And lots of people are infected with parasitic helminth worms. We don't live in a part of the world where we see much of this, but you go to some parts of the globe, this is not uncommon. So again, some are small, on the order of a millimeter in size. Remember how small that is. Upwards of 25 meters in length. Convert that into US inches. 75 feet long. Yeah, inside somebody. Hard to fathom, but it's true. Most of them have a way of attaching themselves to your digestive tract. Typically, it's the small intestine. The inner lining of the small intestine is where these things will often attach themselves, although they can go to other places in the body, as we'll learn about too. Some can burrow into the lungs. Oh, it's all sorts of interesting examples. The heart. Some of these are very motile, so they can penetrate tissues and move around in your body. But typically at some point in their life, they get to the digestive system, because that's where you're providing the parasite with food, basically. This is a tapeworm, which we'll talk about in a few moments. This is called a fluke. Notice that both of these have suckers. That's where they will bring the food in, and or help to attach themselves to the lining of the small intestine, for example. Notice the well-developed reproductive system. So we've got testes to produce sperm. We've got ovaries here to produce eggs. Same applies for the tapeworm. These segments are called proglottids, as you'll learn about in a few minutes. And these proglottid segments contain the various forms of the eggs and the sperm. The head end, or anterior end, of the tapeworm, shown right here, has the suckers that are going to absorb the nutrients, and also something called the scolex, which I'll show you in a few minutes, which has these razor-sharp hooks that help it actually embed into the intestinal lining. So let's talk about a couple categories of parasitic helminth worms. The first ones are called the flatworms, as you can tell here. Flatworms get their name from the fact that they are very, very flat. And so this would contain, as we saw earlier, the tapeworms and the flukes, very flattened. Here is the pork tapeworm. Again, look super close. You can see these proglotid segments here. This is the worm that can be upwards of 75 feet long. If you were to pull one out of a pig, or maybe even a human, I suppose, could have tapeworms that are extremely long, like 75 plus feet. And so what ends up happening is you would ingest usually a form of the tapeworm by eating either raw or undercooked meat. Now we're using the example here of the pork tapeworm, but there's also beef tapeworms too. So let's assume you're eating pork. It has not been cooked sufficiently. The pig had been contaminated with the tapeworm, and a stage of it, which you don't need to know the name of, it basically encysts in the muscle of the pig. You eat the undercooked pork, it gets into your body. It will then undergo a morphologic developmental change into the form that you recognize here as the adult tapeworm, shown also here in the upper left-hand photograph. And the adult tapeworm will use its scolex, which is shown here. So this structure right here with the little black hooks on it, it's called the scolex. These are the suckers. There's, I think, upwards of 4 suckers here on the head end of the tapeworm. So the scolex embeds itself into the lining of the small intestine, where it will then absorb, again, the pre-digested food provided by you. These end proglotid segments on the distal end of the tapeworm contain well-developed reproductive structures. And so when you get to the very, very end, this is where the eggs have become fertilized. And these proglotid segments can break off, basically, and pass through the rest of the digestive system, and basically are passed into the feces and outside. And if, say, some pigs or other animals were to ingest, say, grass that has some of these proglotid segments containing the fertilized eggs in them, then the pig is ingesting the tapeworm, and we repeat the process. There's an encyst form that develops in the muscle of the pig. If another person eats it, it repeats the cycle. Now, another really interesting thing about tapeworms is the fact that not only are they taking nutrients away from you, but sometimes these forms of the tapeworm have the ability to penetrate into other parts of the body, not just the digestive system, but it can go up into the brain, it can go into your eye, it can go into the lungs. Yeah, it's pretty crazy. So you can check out the CDC site that talks more about tapeworms. Here's a small little 3-minute video that you might find interesting. The Monster Inside Me series, which was popular about, I don't know, 10, 15, 20 years ago, talks about tapeworms. So check it out. The other group that we want to talk briefly about are the roundworms. So roundworms are round as opposed to flat. Okay, so we had the flatworms a few moments ago, like the tapeworm and the flukes. Now we're coming to the second major group, the roundworms. They have the ability to also cause major issues in you and me. And here's one particular roundworm called Ascaris. That's the genus, and it causes ascariasis. That's the disorder. Here's the photograph of 2 adult Ascaris roundworms. These are probably about 10 inches in length, and you can again see where it gets the name roundworm. If you were to ingest the eggs of a roundworm, fertilized eggs of a roundworm, This would eventually pass into your digestive tract. And there the worm would form into the adult. So we can see the female and the males, again, shown in the upper right-hand corner. This is what you'd have in your small intestine. In fact, here is an actual resected bowel of a human. And look at all the roundworms inside. This is the large intestine, probably. So they can extend down into the large intestine, but I know they form in the small intestine. But yeah, it's hard to believe, but it can really ravage the digestive tract. And what makes these things even worse is that some of these worm stages will actually burrow out of the small intestine and burrow into the lungs. And then when you cough up the larvae, and it goes back into your digestive system. So it's sort of like a constant inoculation you're doing of the parasite. It's nasty. And as you can tell, one symptom of this is not only abdominal pain, but also weight loss, because no nutrients are getting absorbed into your digestive blood vessels and distributed through the body. It's all going into the production of these worms. Yeah, so it's pretty crazy. Eventually, a stage of the developed egg, fertilized egg, will pass into the feces and out. And again, if one were to somehow ingest these microscopic structures, either through water or eating a vegetable that was rinsed with water, for example, that had the eggs, that's how you could get roundworms. So again, always take bottled water with you when you go traveling, especially to the tropics, because you never know. The odds of you getting tapeworm or roundworm are not super great generally, but there are parts of the globe where this is more common. And so it just pays to do your due diligence and do your research and see if any of this is possible if you're traveling to some corner of the earth where conditions are not super sanitary. Your book talks about an interesting roundworm, which is not really something that's going to kill you. In fact, a lot of people encounter this in their children. This is pinworm, Enterobius vermicularis. Human pinworm is something, again, that tends to target kids more than adults. So what ends up happening is, as kids are playing outside, they're playing in the dirt, in the soil, they can get these microscopic eggs on their fingers, under their fingernails. They come home, they don't wash their hands, they have dinner, lunch, whatever. You know how kids are, fingers in their mouth all the time. They can self-infect themselves, or they can get cross-infected by playing with another kid that has the worms on them and their fingers, and they're playing, they touch each other, that kind of thing. And so it's spread through the fecal-oral route. So oral, of course, is where the worms are ingested. They can survive, however, 2 to 3 weeks on bedding, clothing, and other objects. But eventually, the kids will unknowingly swallow the infective pinworm eggs, and eventually that can pass through the digestive system of the child. Now, how do you get diagnosed with pinworm if you're suspecting this in your kid? Well, usually, believe it or not, as disgusting as it sounds, if the kid is scratching his butt a lot, that suggests possible pinworm infection. Diagnosis is made by identifying the worm or its eggs. Worms can sometimes be seen on the skin near the anus or on underwear, pajamas, or sheets about 2 to 3 hours after the child falls asleep. They can also be collected and examined using a tape test as soon as the person wakes up. This test is done by pressing a piece of adhesive cellophane tape to the anus around, or to the skin around the anus. The eggs stick to the tape, and then tape is examined under the microscope for the eggs. So again, this itching and scratching in the anal area is super common with pinworm inspections. You can also sample underneath the fingernails. You might find some eggs there, although you rarely find it in stool or urine samples. So how can you treat pinworm if you suspect your child has it? Well, there's different kinds of medications you can give. Anybody who comes into contact with the infected person should be treated, as well as the child. Reinfection can occur so easily, so it's important to obtain good hand hygiene, washing hands and all that sort of stuff. But again, it's not something that's going to kill your child or kill you. It's just one of those things, kind of like lice, I guess, that rears its ugly head once in a while. But there are certain drugs that can be prescribed that will kill these particular roundworms. Okay, well, that wraps up chapter 5. I wanted to remind you that we have our first exam coming up next week. 90 points. All of the 4 exams in micro are 90 points apiece. And all of the exams will have a very similar format, as I mentioned on here: multiple choice, matching, perhaps some true false definition, short answer, and typically your choice of 1 or 2 essays. Usually I give you 3 or 4 choices. Now, I'm not saying you're going to see all of these types of questions on the test, but I reserve the right to have those sorts of questions appear on the test. But you're definitely going to see multiple choice. You're definitely going to have some writing to do, or typing, in the case of you're taking it online. And that pretty much wraps up chapter 5. Chapter 6 is viruses, and we'll begin that next week.